All right. For the sake of starting on time, why don't we get started as people kind of finish coming on in? Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our exclusive customer webinar, Policy, Plans, and Frameworks, Effective Governance for Small Businesses. Governance has a reputation for being complicated, enterprise heavy, and just a little bit boring. But today we're going to cut through the noise and focus on what governance actually looks like for smaller businesses. Before we get started, just a reminder that we always encourage questions. Simply use the chat or QA function at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our host today, someone I think you all know, our CEO, Reg Harnish. Reg?
Thank you very much. And for those of you who had the fortitude and the guts to show up today for this exciting topic, I applaud you, because while this is probably the thing in cybersecurity that gets skipped the most, or let's just say shortcut the most, it's honestly one of the most critical foundational elements to a good cybersecurity program. And I probably sound like a cybersecurity professor right now, but I have in practice seen this work exactly that way, which is an organization spending the time on their governance assets like policies and procedures in a way that truly benefits the organization. And I've seen the opposite too, where, under certainly due pressure for sure, an organization just starts assembling a cybersecurity program only to get 6 months or 12 months or 24 months in and now wondering why they aren't making more progress, or why they're not meeting company objectives, or why they're not creating an asset for the organization, something that creates competitive advantage and reduces costs. So I love this topic. Agreed, will be a little bit dry. I'm going to try and keep it spicy, but no doubt this is not for the faint of heart. But again, credit to all of you for seeing the importance of this and investing the time with me today. And hopefully you guys have some questions. So let me get started. You guys all know me, so I'm not going to spend any time on this. Although one thing I will mention is that I do have the dubious role here of essentially at least reviewing and approving any of our own internal governance structures here as well, which, by the way, just like you, they all need work here. Our cybersecurity program is never perfect, never will be. And so we're in constant flux and self-assessment and updating here. So stick with me today. Let's start with a few poll questions, and I will ask our amazing host, Dana, to help us with this. So the first question is, let me grab this. I guess more of a true-false statement, I guess that is what it is. I would prefer that the rules of the road changed every time I drove my car, meaning every time you pulled it out of the garage, you'd have to relearn what was expected of you as a driver in New York State, in the United States. Well, overwhelmingly here. So most of you disagree. I kind of suspected that. Let's move on to the next question, poll number 2. A little different. So when we think about the community, I would prefer that other drivers could make up their own rules of the road while driving. So less about your own behaviors, expectations, measurements, processes, but rather, how would this work for, do you need me to stop this exit poll or end this poll, Dana? I'm still seeing the first question.
No, it should have gone to the other one.
Let's try this again.
Yeah,
so we'll get the poll up for you here momentarily.
Sorry, a little technical. This is the first one real quick. Why don't we just make sure we grab all these and then we'll go to the next one.
So in this case, for question number 2, it's really about what you expect of others and how you preserve your own safety and security and meeting your objectives, getting to your destination, when everyone else on the road can make up their own rules. Give everyone a second here to respond. Okay, similar results. Let's move on to the last question. Some of this isn't really just about where you're going or safety and security, but rather, does the system work? And so I would prefer that my car not have a speedometer or gas gauge. And I'm guessing from prior responses that I know how you feel. So good. All right. Well, these are not designed to be trick questions. They are rather designed to be a simple analogy to help us get into the mindset of what governance truly is. Because you are actually quite good at it in certain conditions, and driving is probably one of them, even though on occasion you may exceed the speed limit or roll through a stop sign. The reality is that working within a system where there are rules and policies and consequences for violating those, and established goals and benefits, all of that is very relevant to what we're going to be talking about here today. So thank you for indulging us in those simple questions. Let's go through an introduction, create some awareness here around what governance really means to smaller organizations. Again, having 6 years under our belt these days, we've seen a lot of this. And one of the things that I did as I was doing some research for this presentation is I combed the web for other people's or other organizations' definition of governance. And I couldn't find a single one that I liked or I thought was relevant and specific enough for smaller organizations. So this is the OrbitalFire definition, right? So orchestrating all of these different types of assets, from policies and plans and guidelines to procedures and frameworks, like these all contribute in different ways to a governance program and the ability to create a system in which we all operate. But also with the ultimate goal of managing risk and creating benefit to the business, right? Meeting objectives. And again, I mentioned a few. Competitive advantage is something that we talk about all the time, because we know that if done well, cybersecurity can create massive or eliminate hurdles in your sales process, or help you beat a competitor to the next prospect. It can reduce costs. It can create efficiencies. It can create awareness and intelligence about your business. It has tons and tons of benefits, all of which stem from the governance program itself. So here's our definition of governance. And why do we do this? I kind of alluded to a few of these, but when it comes down to practicing governance, operationalizing it, we want to establish and promote practices that we know are working in our organization. Sometimes that takes a little bit of experimentation. So if a travel policy that prohibits going to Canada doesn't work, well, we edit that and we improve it and update it and then promote it. Consistency, right? So we at any time during the day, we may be asked about what our program is and what it does and how well we're executing in cybersecurity. And if we're speaking a completely different language, then it's very difficult to translate. It's very difficult to communicate your commitment to cybersecurity and just how far you've come, how much progress you've made. Next, the one that I think most people think about, which is when we think of policies, this is really about what are the rules for the road for your employees and your contractors and the folks, the individuals, and I guess in this case, it really could be any human being over which you have some authority, or at least where you have some authority in their security behaviors. Could be vendors, third parties, volunteers, your board members, but essentially these individuals, they need policies. They need to understand what you expect of them. And then, of course, the speedometer and the navigation system, which is how close to our goal are we? Or how quickly are we moving and getting there? Did we take a wrong turn? So that ability to measure our progress in cybersecurity becomes critical. All of that comes from good governance and then assessment, which most of you are engaged in at this point anyway. How do they work together? We're not going to spend time going through all of these. This isn't even an exhaustive list of the kinds of governance assets that we utilize. Today, we're going to spend some time on what we believe to be the three most important and relevant assets to smaller organizations. Again, standards, super important. You've all heard of NIST 171 or the HIPAA security rule. That's a standard in some ways. Controls, we've all talked about those. But today we're going to spend time on these three. We think that these are the most impactful and the most important to get right out of the gate. So operationalizing governance, what does this actually look like? So let's agree that we all see the benefit of this and we're committed to doing better in our governance sphere of cybersecurity. Let's start with frameworks. Frameworks go back a very, very long way. This doesn't show everything, but you can see if you've been doing this for a year, you've heard of, some of the changes in the manufacturing industry around CMMC. If you've been doing this for 5 years, you probably have heard of or have used benchmarks from CIS or one of their public frameworks, moving into, the folks have been doing this for 20 years or more, decades. NIST 53 is getting a little bit long in the tooth these days. It's as effective as it is. It's almost 20 years old now. So frameworks have been around for a long time. And the reason is they really work. And why do they work? Well, because they collect all of the things that we want to do. They create a roadmap for us and a checklist. So they organize, they assemble, they make certain recommendations in terms of the implementation of certain controls and framework elements. They may even provide a methodology like NIST 171 or NIST 30. So tremendous open source, public domain guidance on how to develop a cybersecurity program step by step, how to get there, and then, of course, how to measure it. So frameworks are an incredible tool. And for any of you who are engaging us for any kind of either compliance assessment work or vCISO, you know that we speak frameworks all the time, and we reference them as sort of our North Star as we're building cybersecurity programs. And in fact, we almost refuse to build a program that isn't based on a framework. I'm going to come back to that a little bit. So some examples of frameworks, sticking with the driving analogy here. So what would be a control or a best practice that you might see in this driving framework, this road rage framework? First, drivers should be effective. They should be licensed. They should be trained. There should be some experience. They should have spent some time behind the wheel. Drivers should also drive on the right side of the road. Now, this is not true of every country. And so it's important to know which industry or which community you are operating in or building a cybersecurity program in, because in some countries, driving on the left is actually encouraged strongly, and you want to make sure that you're compliant with those types of things. Roads should have speed limits. So it's not always a requirement or best practice that is imposed on you, the program, the cybersecurity program developer, maintainer. Sometimes it is indicative of the system that we work in. In this case, you don't have any control over the speed limits on the road, but you are expected to comply. The HIPAA security rule is a great example where it's a framework that is enforced by a regulatory mandate, right? So you may not have any authority over those requirements. And then in some cases, you may have complete control. Vehicles should be roadworthy, another best practice, right? Otherwise likely to cause safety and security or other, progress type issues, and drivers shouldn't tailgate. We can argue that all of these are best practices. All of them are really designed with those end outcomes, those objectives in mind, right? Which is getting from A to Z safely, securely, on time. But I think we could also all agree that every one of these are things that we violate. And we are not perfect, and there are exceptions. So just like a framework, just like the HIPAA security rule and NIST 171 and New York State DFS, we recognize that these frameworks are up to our interpretation to a degree. So what does effective mean? Right side of the road would seem binary, but the reality is if you have to pass, there will be times when you drive on the left side of the road. Speed limits, roadworthiness, these are all things that from a framework perspective, they establish best practices, things that have been proven to work well in many systems, in many cases, under many conditions. and they provide us an objective, right, in terms of building a program. What do some frameworks look like? Most of you have seen these. Again, if you've worked with us for any time, you've probably heard of all of these. So if you're in manufacturing, or if you're just a general organization that maybe your industry hasn't adopted fully any specific framework, NIST 171 is incredible. It's very effective. It's a broad yet not so deep, very relevant to small organizations, easily adopted, and honestly, easily achieved if you just put some commitment into this. In the manufacturing space, this is the Bible. In healthcare, of course, HIPAA, the security rule. If you are in insurance or real estate or payroll or certain types of financial services, New York State Department of Financial Services, they have their own minimum standards framework that you need to comply with on an annual basis. If you're a retailer or a merchant and you're selling things online, you have to comply with the payment card industry, or otherwise PCI, the DSS, the data security standards, NIST 53, ISO 27. There are lots of frameworks. Now, the trick, of course, is to do a few things. One is selecting an appropriate framework. Generally speaking, most of you either work in an industry or a covered entity under a regulatory mandate where the framework is chosen for you. You don't really have a choice. If you handle protected health information, you are either a covered entity or you are a business associate, and thusly you are subject to the HIPAA security rule and other things. So that framework, of course, it's appropriate, but it's been selected for you. So what are the 3 steps? Well, first, select one that is relevant. Relevant means it will produce value to your organization. So it's relevant, meaning my business, my organization deals with these types of issues, and this framework will work best for us in terms of creating creating compliance for us and satisfying those regulatory mandates, or creating defensibility for us, meeting expectations. The next step would be to select a framework that is desirable. So now this is an inward facing objective where, hey, as a business, I think this best practice aligns with our needs better. Even though I'm in healthcare, I still feel like NIST 171 is a better framework. Well, you could argue that, of course, and it may be more desirable. The question is it relevant to you and your organization? And then last, you want to identify and adopt a primary framework. So we have numerous customers that have matured their programs to a point where one framework doesn't satisfy all of their objectives, and we have to expand the program into other areas. Generally, we're covering more ground. It's a broader framework, more requirements, more work to do, but it creates a cybersecurity program that is relevant and desirable, with leaning on a single primary framework as part of that. So, for example, we have some New York State DFS customers, because the DFS is a bit of an abbreviated framework, that have expanded into NIST. And that's because they take cybersecurity seriously. The DFS didn't satisfy all the needs, didn't cover all of the risks of the organization, and so we help them expand into a broader program. Relevant, desirable, and primary. Now, all of these, you probably have one framework, and that is most common. And no matter what you select out of those 3 steps, you want to make sure that it is that framework that you're using to conduct risk assessments and to manage risk in your organization, so that we can measure it against your best practices framework. But also, from a compliance standpoint, we want to make sure that whatever framework we have selected gets us closer to being compliant, right? And satisfying all of these third-party pressures and obligations. Okay, let's move on to policies, right? So we think of your written information security plan, which is a governance structure, your frameworks, maybe even your regulatory language. Those are all sort of at the very highest level. In the middle, we need something that's a little more operational, something that is a little clearer in establishing, identifying, illustrating expectations of your people, process, and technology. And so that's where policies come in, and probably the thing that you're most familiar with, because you had policies long before you invested in cybersecurity, and you will long after. So policies don't just apply to cybersecurity. They really apply to any expectation or behavioral standard that you want to set in your organization. Again, our definition couldn't find a good one in our industry, so we came up with our own. So policies define and communicate, two very important steps. Security behaviors for all of your assets. And your assets fall into three categories: people, process, technologies. Everything you do falls into one of those categories. Now, what ties them all together is that they are associated with a common entity. So your policies are always written for your organization. Now, you're honoring your framework, right? Your primary desired or relevant framework to identify which language do I need to cover, which expectations and behaviors do I need to model or illustrate for folks, or my firewall, for that matter. But the policy is where the rubber starts to hit the road. Let's go back to our driving analogy here. So where frameworks establish best practices that can conceivably be accepted or optional in some ways. Not optional is not the right word, but we can compensate for differences. Policies, generally speaking, these establish the exact rules of your organization. So now, while the frameworks recommend that the drivers be effective, in this case, in New York State, drivers must be licensed. It's not optional. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't policy violations in this case, and as we know, there are, but policies, without exception, you need a license to operate a motor vehicle. The vehicle must be registered and insured, and there are certain requirements around that as well. Again, it's not always about the people. Sometimes it's about the technology and establishing the expected behaviors and outcomes for those types of assets as well. No exceptions. Every vehicle in New York State, whether it's a trailer that you're towing or it's a motorcycle, that has to be registered and insured in New York State or you can't use it. Again, are there violations? Of course. But from our perspective, we developed a policy because there are no exceptions. It's a must or a shall comply. Laws and road signs, obviously, I'm pretty sure I sped on the way to work today here. So even though I knew the policy in my state was 55 miles an hour on a highway, the reality is under certain conditions, I am willing to exceed that, even though there may be consequences. Now let's get into policies that extend those frameworks and best practice. Because in this case, New York State, of course, obviously, they don't really care if you hit potholes. Otherwise, we would take care of our roads. But there may be a policy in your organization that speaks to behaviors and outcomes and expectations that go well beyond those frameworks. Now, and as long as they're not in conflict with the framework, everything goes. This is highlighted because there's nothing in the rule book about avoiding potholes. Now, we can all agree, I believe, that avoiding potholes safely makes perfect sense. And so you may establish a policy like that. And then they make it very, very tailored or very specific to your organization, right? So cleaning your car on a regular basis. You're not going to find that in the New York State driving handbook. You're just not. But is it best practice? I guess you could argue one way or another, but it doesn't matter. The policies that you establish for your organization can extend beyond those best practices, and sometimes they do. One example of a policy that kind of bridges cybersecurity and let's say HR is a progressive discipline policy. So it probably has a process and a checklist and things that some expectations and desired objectives. But what you do and how you handle repeated infractions or violations of your policy is completely up to you. There's no prescription for that. So whether someone immediately goes in a performance improvement plan or is terminated is completely up to you. Now, the framework will tell you that there should be a progressive discipline process and it should follow certain best practices. As long as you do that, the prescription, the actual process and procedure is really up to you. The policy is yours to create and enforce. And that's the beauty of policies, is we get to take all of these established frameworks, create policies from them, and then, of course, tailor them where they make sense. And again, as long as we're not in direct conflict with those frameworks, we are doing better work and setting better expectations for our organization. What are some examples of policies? You're all familiar with these, right? Access control, workforce security. These are cybersecurity specific things. You have all seen them we have probably written your policies for you, and so you've all seen this, starts to get a little more adjacent to cybersecurity in an acceptable use, because there are things commonly in an acceptable use policy that may not directly relate back to a control in a framework, and that's perfectly fine. An alternate work site, something that we've been dealing with for 5 or 6 years now. What makes for an acceptable alternate work site? Like things like it should be free from tampering or eavesdropping. It should be, it should have a secure network. You should be free of distractions, things like that. Most of that is very personal and tailored to specific organizations. And what you think is an acceptable work site may be different than someone else. Now, the framework recommends that you define for your organization what an acceptable alternate work site looks like. What are those requirements, whether it's 2 or 20, but it doesn't tell you specifically which ones you should adopt. That's really up to you. And then we get into a few other areas that you're not going to find in the framework. Things like progressive discipline. The name progressive discipline does not show up in NIST, even though there are NIST controls that suggest and recommend as a best practice that you have a way to tie cybersecurity violations to consequences. And then a policy on policies. This is something that the industry invented, because while you may be reviewing and updating your policies on an annual basis, and that is kind of a best practice, you may not even have a policy on policies. And it is exactly what it says, which is, here's our expected behaviors and outcomes and objectives on how we deal with policies, which is we must have them. We must review and update them as necessary at least once per year, things like that. So you can kind of see how policies are the layer down. We're going to start to get into operationalizing other things here momentarily. But why do we do policies, right? We want to make sure that expectations, the objectives that we set out for ourselves, the obligations that we define, the rules of the road for our people, process, and technology align directly with our primary framework. Now, again, most of you have the luxury of selecting a single framework which does all three of those things. If you have multiple frameworks, we're really leaning on that primary framework to define these policies. And that is a consideration as we're deciding on, hey, which one of these should be our primary. It's an in-depth conversation. Assessing compliance with your own policies. Can't tell you how many times I've run into an organization who had beautiful policies. They spent 20 grand on these, hired a law firm to write them. They're 300 pages deep, but they have no idea if they're even compliant with all of this language and all of these expectations that they've set. Secondarily, if it's 300 pages, guess what? No one's going to read it. And even if they do read it, they're not going to remember it. So you've made it difficult for your people to comply with. Policies should be short and simple, as short as possible. Very simple language, no jargon, avoid acronyms and things like that. If you're expecting your people to review and attest to complying with these policies annually, they have to understand them, or they're just decorations. And then last, one of the things that we have settled on as a major crutch for many organizations is what we call a quick reference. So what we do is we pull out, tease out all the things that are really relevant to your average, knowledge worker, someone who's working on a computer all day, but may not be, programming a firewall or building code or, responsible for administrative level activities or cybersecurity. And in those cases, there may only be 10 or 20 things that you really want your people to understand. So yes, they need to read and attest to the policy, but we're going to help you. We're going to create a little laminated, placard or a mouse pad that has all of these things, or just a document where you can reference, hey, how am I supposed to handle EPHI? Can you give me the top 8 things that I need to remember? Make it easy for your people. Policies can be obtuse. If we're meeting the objectives and we're really going as far as we need to define every desirable behavior, it could be lengthy. So let's make it easy for our workforce and simplify that for them in a quick reference. Okay, last asset we're going to talk about today is our plans. Now, plans address operational security in situations where conditions, variables may change, right? So the idea behind a plan is that there are inputs to the plan which create outputs. And as inputs change, so will the outputs, and so will the the processes that we execute as part of the plan. Those may also change. Let's take some common analogies here. So if I'm driving and it's a rainy Friday morning, well, I'm going to need an extra large coffee because I know traffic's going to be horrible. I'm going to avoid 87 South at all costs, right? All this makes sense to most of you who are probably in the area. And then I need Sirius XM Spa droning on in my ears to calm me, right? So that's a plan. So there are conditions. What day of the week is it? What time of day? What's the weather like? All of these things are things that you practice. You have these driving plans in your head already. You may skip over and take Route 9 instead, or you may wait an extra half an hour before you leave in the morning. All of these things are operational plans, just like your cybersecurity plans as well. Let's look at another one. So if you're in a situation where clearly you're experiencing road rage, stay in your vehicle, roll the windows up, and once again, calming music never hurts. So having a plan to deal with these situations, it may not be expected, it may not be exactly what you had planned for, but you've got a plan that helps you make decisions on the fly based on inputs and variables and conditions and meeting those desired outcomes, right? Because again, in both cases, we want to make it to work on time, safely, and securely, right? So that's the objective, but all of the conditions can change on a minute-by-minute basis, right? There's a tornado watch out there right now. That may change some of your commutes on the way home today. What do these look like? Most of these you have heard of. A few of them are industry specific, but the one that we focus on very heavily is your incident response plan, because we know that cybercrime is as variable as things come these days. Even if there are patterns and some consistencies across attack patterns and things like that, the reality is we never know when it's going to happen. We may not know which assets are impacted, which data is affected, who's in the office. So there's a lot of variables. But an effective incident response plan considers all of those variabilities and helps you operationalize a plan towards your objective regardless. Same thing with the business continuity plan. It may be a power outage. It may be someone spilled a Jolt Cola on a server. It could be a fire in the cafeteria. All of these things create business disruptions. You may not be planning for any of them. All of them are entirely different, but the business continuity plan helps us focus our people, process, and technology towards a desired outcome, which is minimization of business disruption. Your DRP, your emergency mode operations plan, which is a healthcare specific plan, or just a general crisis management plan, which we do see on occasion as well. All of these help you operationalize particular specific prescribed behaviors and activities based on a number of variable conditions, all to achieve a desired objective or multiple objectives, right? So what makes sense in a plan? Let's talk a little bit about this. First, again, you want to base your plan on an established standard. So we didn't make up incident response. We didn't even make up the basic process for incident response. That's something that many smart people over decades have built standards for. And again, going back to frameworks like NIST 66 or NIST 61, my apologies, for incident response, it does a great job of identifying a whole bunch of things that we should be considering. What questions should we be asking ourselves? What decisions should we be prepared to make? That standard, NIST 61, is an incredible resource for us to build an incident response plan off. And every incident response plan we have ever built has been based on that standard, no exceptions. But we also want to test, because we know that the plan is just that, it's a plan. It does not account for every eventuality. It does not help you with specifics at times, because it would be hard to model every permutation. So testing the plan becomes really important. Your ability to apply that plan, of course, is paramount. Like, it's one thing to have a great plan, but if you don't even know where it is, or you don't have anyone trained on the plan, then you're likely to miss your objectives. The plan itself should go as far as it can around providing guidance, particularly around big decisions like, hey, do we pay ransoms? Is that allowed here? Or, who are our alternate, uh, paper supply providers? Like, where can we get that stuff? Or a redundant internet provider. When do we switch over to that? So those kinds of decisions are not things that you want to be figuring out in the heat of battle. You want to have guidance in your plans to help you get funneled towards an effective, objective-driven decision. Now, again, as I mentioned, you can't model every permutation. And so there is a balance here to building a plan that is so long because it has so much guidance that you don't even know where to look for things, or something that's too short and doesn't provide enough material for us to make good decisions. So providing adequate is going to be up to you. Should be roles and responsibilities in your plans. Who's doing what? When are they doing it? What are we expecting of them? And your people should be trained on their roles and responsibilities. Again, whether it's your business continuity plan, crisis management, if you haven't trained your people, then you can assume that they will be ineffective. And this is a common problem as we conduct, and are doing more and more tabletops for our customers. There may be people who are named in a plan who don't even know that the plan exists. And certainly they don't have a copy, and they're, of course, not trained or tested on these things. So we want to make sure that we're testing the plans just like any other security control. That document is a security control. And that's why it's named in a framework. NIST 171, the HIPAA security rule, New York State DFS, basically every framework that we utilize today recommends that you have an effective incident response plan that has roles and responsibilities well defined, where you are testing on a regular basis, and you are training anyone who's named in that document. These are all things that produce better outcomes. And again, things that we have been doing for a very long time. Okay, I have a couple final thoughts. Send some questions in if you've got anything that you want to talk about today. But first, we're hitting on a few of the key governance assets today, but there are many others that might work better depending on your situation. We would love to have a conversation with you about your governance assets, the structure, the program. We call it our written information security plan, which defines all of your governance assets. We would love to talk to you about the plan that you've built, or if you need us to help you with this, or even just questions on, hey, when do I use a guideline versus a standard? They're very distinctly defined documents. And there are very specific cases in where you would utilize a guideline versus a standard or a checklist or anything else. So please know that there are lots of other things that we use, lots of other tools that we can use in the governance sphere to create better outcomes. And some of them can be complex, to be honest with you. It's there is some overlap and some confusion about the difference between a guideline and a framework, for example. We also know, right, invariably, we're going to have to manage violations and expectations. So in this case, there are always going to be legitimate reasons or use cases for violating your own policy. And guess what? Here's the good news. That's okay. What is not okay is not knowing about it, not documenting it, and not approving it in some, or monitoring and managing this exception in some material way. So the first thing you want to do is identify a condition under which you just cannot comply with your own cybersecurity policy. So 99% of the time, we're good. That other 1%, we need to identify those conditions and situations. We want to document them. The next thing is we want to propose those as an approved exception to the policy. And there should be someone who's familiar with, maybe the author of your policy, who's familiar with, hey, what risks does this introduce? How infeasible is it really? So, there's some game time decisions here in terms of what makes a valid exception. You want to make sure that whoever is doing that is qualified to to draw those conclusions. And then the last is an exception should not be permanent, right? So 6 month to 12 month, a time frame like that is generally what we expect and recommend for all exceptions, which means if your exception is approved in June, guess what you're going to have to do in December? You're going to have to re-evaluate that exception that was requested and either approve or reject it, and then update the expiration date as necessary. And there should be a policy for this, right? This is not rocket science. I would agree that the evaluation of what makes a valid, legitimate exception, there's probably some nerdiness and some science and art in there. But the process itself is actually very simple. You're kind of looking at it right now, which is identify, document, request or ticket and approve or reject. There's got to be an evaluation and then define an expiration. The rest of it is pretty much common sense. But have a policy. Add this to your policy. And what this does for auditors is it drives them nuts a little bit. But what we have done here is any of your policy violations, as long as they go through this process, I don't want to say you can have as many exceptions as you want, but it's very difficult for an auditor to argue with you that you are not compliant with your own policy when you have an exceptions policy and all of known exceptions have been driven through that process. It drives auditors crazy, but that's part of our job. And then lastly, you need to maintain your governance assets. So really important that you're reviewing all of these. One, for efficacy, right? Are these the frameworks that we should still be utilizing? Do we need to update our policies? Measuring whether or not they are resilient and durable documents. You shouldn't have to update your policy more than once per year unless there are massive changes in your organization. And I would argue even longer for a framework. Like if you've adopted the HIPAA security rule, there's a really good reason for that, and that's not going anywhere. So even though we're expecting some hippity security rule changes over the next, probably 6 to 12 months, the reality is the security rule is what we've adopted. The framework itself is going to go through revisions, as most NIST, CIS, ISO 27000, like all of them are going through revisions. You will expect that, but the policy, the frameworks themselves, those are resilient and durable decisions and documents. We want to make sure that we're assessing, are we getting better at these every year? Is our policy better and better tailored to our organization every year? Of course, it should be. Again, monitoring for exceptions or deviations. A deviation in this case is an undocumented exception. So we want to assess or self-assess against our own policy by doing a framework-based risk assessment, which is what we do for you. You get two birds with one stone. Not only do you get a valid risk assessment based on another standard, of course, but also anywhere there are deviations from that, or there are deficiencies in the assessment, you can pretty much be guaranteed that there's a non-compliance condition with a policy. Because if we've also built your policy, well, it's directly derived from your framework. And then, of course, visibility to all of this stuff, which is your board, your leadership, the folks who are most accountable for these things should be aware that they exist. They should be aware that they have undergone some changes and updates. They should know what standards have we adopted. Like these are things that are not just for your audit committee of your board, but for your leadership, your decision makers in your organization as well. And again, we don't expect them to be experts in any of these things, but creating awareness and reporting, one, creates better citizens, right? Better cybersecurity citizens, but two, that's also expected of you as part of any information security management system, which is visibility, communication, education on the governance assets themselves, and thusly your cybersecurity program. Now, that's what I have for today. Would love to take any questions that you guys have, but I won't put you on the spot. Oh, sorry. I won't put you on the spot. If there's questions that come up afterwards, please talk to your customer success specialist. Email me. I accidentally stopped sharing, but my email address, I believe most of you have this, just reg@orbitalfire.com. If you can't remember that, support@orbitalfire.com will always get you to the right security subject matter expert here as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dana to see if there are any questions.
Reg, we've just got one right now, and thank you for that. It's how do you get employees to actually take the policies seriously, not just sign and forget, or the board or leadership, or talk about the different stakeholders in an organization?
One of the hardest things we do is change security behaviors in humans. So uh, let's just get that out of the way. It's not easy. However, you can make it easier by doing a few things. One, getting them involved. So if you're building a policy in a vacuum that completely, defines completely different expectations than your handbook or your values or just your culture, you're asking for problems, right? Your policy should align with your values and your culture, just like it should align with a framework. If there aren't consequences for policy violations, if you aren't educating and testing effectively your people on these, so training on a regular basis, testing on a regular basis, then the attestation it becomes meaningless, and you're not going to meet those objectives. But we oftentimes we refer to human beings as human firewalls, and our industry is just famous for bad advice. Don't treat your people like firewalls. They're human, organic, fallible, beings with bad days and feelings and emotions, but they also have a lizard brain that can be motivated by doing some of these things. So recognizing people who are your top performers, whether it's training compliance or it's reporting something that they thought could have turned out to be an incident, like recognize them, make it part of your culture, write in your job descriptions, consider cybersecurity performance in your annual evaluations, your performance evaluations for your employees. Stitch cybersecurity and those behaviors into everything that you do. Align them with your values, align them with your culture, and base them on a framework. Communicate, educate. All of those things can produce significantly better outcomes with policies. But the quick reference is another sort of cheat code for all of this. We have to be reasonable with what we can expect from our employees as well, especially if we're not super happy with the quality or the length of our policy. We have to continue to work on all of that. So there's some tips, but I'd love to talk in more depth about your specific condition and situation. So just email me, and we'll set up some time to discuss.
That's
Anything
great,
else?
Reg. That's the only questions we have right now. So as you
Fabulous.
said, right, reg@orbitalfire.com or support@orbitalfire.com. And every 2 months, we do these customer exclusive webinars, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Yeah, and thank you for being the stoic cybersecurity, performers and showing up for a governance presentation. I love it. Thank you. Have a great day, and we'll see all of you soon.
Thank you all.